influence on modern man is that of classical Greece. Our present views on politics, philosophy, sex and science all have their roots in the ancient Greek texts. In Greek Fire, which is up next, we go back to the past in order to find out about our future.
T-minus 275 minutes. Install the angle of attack meter. Install the angle of attack meter.
This monument of 20th century progress is dedicated to an ancient god. Why, 2,000 years into the Christian era, are we still building temples to Apollo?
Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
Why do we even think of this journey, beyond the bounds of our planet into space itself, as an odyssey? And name those who embark upon it astronauts, perhaps unaware that we are calling them star sailors in ancient Greek. Now, technology empowers us to realize dreams and realize nightmares, to populate the moon or annihilate the Earth. Our progress is our pride, but restless to move forward, we need always to look back. One ancient culture's relevance is undiminished. Greek fire was a substance developed to destroy enemy ships, which stayed alight in water. The Greek legacy is a flame that time cannot douse. The legacy is vast. Its richness is the magic secret of its endurance.
Ancient Greece is such an enormous, such a rich world, with so many aspects to it and so many achievements, that each age can turn to it to reflect its own priorities, its own preoccupations, and find guidance in the particular things that they're searching for enlightenment in. And what we have then is not one huge monument that always looks the same wherever you look at it from and from whatever time you look at it from, but something shifting, something with so many angles, so many facets, that each age will perceive it differently, each age will derive different things from it.
This is the New World, settled 4 generations ago by pilgrims from the old. They sailed to this uncharted continent to start afresh, to paint a new picture of themselves on the great blank canvas of America. They built a town, the first houses to stand in this valley. Theirs was a dream of the future, but they built it on a vision of the past.
If you haven't proven that you'll give your resources back to him, and the more you have, the more you'll give back.
And the past is all about them as the future unfolds, in hints, in guesses. A new picture, but old details are bleeding through it. Greek fire burns even here, in a valley in the American Midwest. For when the Christian settlers searched their imagination for a name to call their town, they recalled a pagan city, distant in time and place, a symbol of stability for those on the edge of the wilderness. But a strange, militaristic city, a city where foreign travel was virtually banned and visitors were not welcome, a city of order and discipline, where healthy boys left home at the age of 5 to join the army, and unhealthy babies were exposed on mountainsides to die. where trade was discouraged and money unwieldy, where unflinching bravery and austerity were universal, where all personal matters, one's diet, one's sex life, one's hopes, one's fears, one's desires, one's movements, were policed by the state. The name they chose was Sparta.
Dave, take some of those cones, put them over on the other side.
Police Lieutenant Francis Haar is the custodian of the community and the spokesman of its spirit.
The idea of Sparta was brought about by one of the early settlers who believed that the quality and the necessary traits of the settlers was indicative of the Spartan people of ancient time.
Ancient time. The past communicates before it's understood. Greece survives as part history, part myth. Rifled, referred to, simply used as a name, a talisman for the frontier spirit. For Lieutenant Haar, who collects police badges, Sparta has become a hobby.
The name Sparta always kind of intrigued me, and my patch collection here includes patches from 7 different Spartas and 1 East Sparta within the United States.
How would you describe the form of government that we have in this country?
Well, this country is a democracy.
The most powerful nation on earth is still a nation of settlers.
That's right.
Greece is a touchstone of confidence for a culture without its own deep historical roots.
Constitution. What is the Constitution?
The Constitution is the fundamental, supreme law of the land.
There is a need for something to look up to look back to. A need waiting to be exploited.
My ancestors came to the New World from England in 1637. Now this pilgrim's going home, to Greece.
My grandparents left Poland and Russia and came to Brooklyn. Now at last I'm going home to Greece.
Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization. That's why every American feels at home in this lovely land. Your own odyssey can begin here. So America, go home to Greece, where it all began.
This Hungarian's going home to Greece.
This is ancient Sparta, once the greatest military power in classical Greece, now fragmented and cryptic. Can we go home to this? So little survives. Greek literature comes to us copied on papyrus in scarcely decipherable tatters. Face to face with them, we feel these letters come from a world immeasurably distant and remote. There is something forbidding about them. Byron wasn't deterred. With typically highbrow vandalism, he carved his name on the temple at Sunion. Lord Byron went home to Greece when it was still an exotic outpost on Europe's eastern edge. His poetry immortalized a new dream of Greece, which entranced his public at home. They too could return to Arcadia in their imagination. Byron made a virtue of the ruins. The broken stones enhanced the pathos of the past. The world was learning to love the fragment. Keats described a most dizzy pain that mingles ancient grandeur with the rude wasting of old time. But fragments evoke more than pathos. Teasingly incomplete, they appeal to us to make them whole. Greece, which so emphasized perfection of form, seduces the imagination because it is itself a fragment. which each generation finds new ways to reconstruct.
Individuals looking at Greece make different selections of what seems to them important about the Greek world. And when you look at the sort of pictures of Greece that have been entertained over the last few hundred years, you can see that a whole generation can form a certain picture, again, constructed really by picking on certain things which were indeed there, but to which the importance, the priority, is attached by the people looking at them, not necessarily attached by the Greeks. For example, there was a fashion at one time to put Sparta in the center of the stage rather than Athens. Sparta, because it was believed to be a uniquely self-disciplined community. Then again, perhaps especially in the 19th century, there was a tendency to imagine that the Greeks were all philosophers. They didn't get their hands dirty. They sat around talking geometry while the slaves did all the work.
The Sacred Way at Delphi. The final steps pilgrims once trod to reach the Temple of Apollo, to seek guidance from the famous oracle. The temple fell into ruins, but the pilgrimage continued. Our history has been shaped by generations of thinkers returning for guidance to this place.
I think overall the most important influence Greece has had on Western civilization is not a permanent influence, but a recurrent one. Every now and then, the Greek texts, Greek art, Greek philosophy are rediscovered or reinterpreted by some influential interpreter, and the effect is in every case revolutionary.
Yet strangely, the most revolutionary interpreters of the Greek ideal never went to Greece. Like Byron's public, the Greece they returned to was no physical place, but a land of the imagination. This imaginative pilgrimage has never ceased.
It might seem a surprise that in the 20th century there should be new influences from ancient Greece. Nonetheless, it is, I think, the case. To understand any century, you probably have to go back to the century before. And there are 3 19th or early 20th century thinkers from the German-speaking world who have had a profound influence on our own time. I'm thinking of Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche.
Karl Marx idealized Greece as the childhood of mankind. His belief that through revolution the world might achieve a utopian future was based in part on his confidence in a utopian past. Friedrich Nietzsche's vision of Greece was his grounds for deriding morality and preaching a doctrine of untrammeled self-fulfillment. His ideas, in a perverted form, became the basis of Nazi ideology. Sigmund Freud gave a Greek structure to his thinking, most famously when he named the Oedipus complex. Through Freud, an interpretation of Greece has formed our century's understanding of itself.
I can't imagine our sense of the ego, our sense of human relations, our sense of neurosis, illness, pathology, a Greek word, therapy, a Greek word. I can't imagine our sense of the struggle between generations, between fathers and mothers and their children, without the Greek structure and model behind it.
The end of the pilgrimage, the Temple of Apollo. Above its door was once an inscription which simply read, "Know thyself." This is the goal of our imaginative pilgrimage, self-knowledge. Interpretations of Greece have molded our cultural unconscious. Our return is an attempt to excavate those interpretations, to understand the forces that have made us what we are. The effect is seldom so dramatic. Greece and the symbolism of Greece permeate our ordinary lives, comforting and familiar. Do we press it that closely? Can it really be a means to revolutionary self-knowledge? Greece is something to cling to for support as much as enlightenment. something we share which is cultural rather than commercial. The most powerful association of Greece is with establishment. The emotional appeal of Greece has been precisely that it reassures us. We think of it as unchanging, a safe point of return, and close to it, we feel secure. Greece is our model, continuous, classic, above particularity. To question this, or to use it as a means of questioning, is to go against the grain. But the solidity of pillars and pediments deceives us. The Greek world was unstable, skeptical and dramatic, a world of questions rather than answers. The Greeks bequeathed a restless desire to attain an ideal, to discover through self-examination how the perfect human life should be lived.
There is no doubt that that tiny rocky peninsula with its islands said to the Western world, we will try and show you that the uses of leisure for sport, for thinking, for art, for dance, for music, for making things beautiful and fascinating, can fit in to a society, have to fit in. And very early on, the Greeks seem to have established inside us that great dream of what a balanced life can be like.
The Greeks turned their gaze inward, mesmerized by the potential they found within themselves. Their world was characterized by the human scale, and they thought the human form the proper subject for the highest art. They wanted to make perfection real. An endless desire to achieve, to progress, drove them on. We have inherited that Greek desire, but how consciously, how critically? Are we aware of the hidden Greek presence all about us in our world? Do we see the latent influence, or simply the blatant one? They are correspondingly pervasive.
I certainly think that times which have no awareness of the past or little awareness of the past are dangerous times. An age that thinks that its own priorities and preoccupations are the only ones that could possibly matter, that has that kind of complacent self-confidence, is an age that's going to run into trouble. And I think in the closing years of the 20th century, there is a new reawakening to the past.
Each age has lived within its goldfish bowl of history, partially blind to its past. But we are made by our past, by the influences we carry with us. The past presents alternatives, frees us to question prejudice and preconception, or at least to trace their origins. The past can free us from the tyranny of the present, a tyranny which the modern world has invented ways of intensifying.
Some lights seem eternal. America's is. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless you.
The way in which we see the world increasingly compresses and edits it. We see an untold wealth of images, places we will never visit, people we will never meet. A nation at a glance, brought to us in the isolation of our homes.
For spacious skies, for amber waves of rain, for purple mountains in majesty.
Technology proliferates information, but can it also deepen knowledge? This eclectic presentation of the world can close us off from one another and from a past which we find increasingly hard to imagine. A past which shaped us, a past which can guide us into our future, out of our parochial present.
We have swung into a very, very private ideal indeed. The belief that the good life is that which we lead in our marriages or love affairs, in our small circles of friendship, that the debts we owe are primarily to those circles and bonds. The famous discussion, rather betray your country than your friend, which is an immensely modern discussion. The feeling that the best of us is behind closed doors. This, to Greek thought, would have been a scandalous failure of human maturity. And the Greeks had clearly foretold our own fate, which is, when you do that, the mafiosi, the thugs, and the third rate move into the seats of power.
The transforming power of technology is our pride and our neurosis. How do we rationalize the chaotic world that power creates?
Now that we are so concerned with the breakdown of our great industrial revolution, whom should we read? Well, in the name of common sense, a passage that actually haunts one, Aristotle said, watch out. If your city gets so big that a cry for help spoken somewhere in the center cannot be heard at the gate, you're probably oversized. The Greeks were among the first to say it is the dignity and nobility of man to pursue research wherever it will lead and at any price. And that means creating life in test tubes, and it means creating the hydrogen bomb, and it means sending men to Mars because of truth, the uncovering. We are suddenly asking ourselves, we who are the children of that Greek ideal, is it going to be too expensive? Can we, in fact, fulfill what has been the guiding thread in the labyrinths and other Greek myths? If the minotaur of self-destruction, nuclear or biogenetic, waits at the end of our search.
Human life is changing more quickly in the past century than in the 20 that went before it. The end of a millennium is a time suggestive and unsettling, a time to reassess. The Greeks are destined always to be a part of that reassessment. Our journey into the future is an odyssey. But odysseys have an inbuilt sense of return to the past. To move forward, we must look back. The Greeks have put that double motion, the desire to do both, deep within us.
edition of Greek Fire. Let's join the program now to explore the journey through history and thought and philosophy.
Whether we're talking about Aesop's fables, Grimm's fairy tales, the Greek legends and myths, whatever, Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, Spider-Man, there seems to be something in the human condition. It seems that people want to imagine that there are worlds, or at least there are aspects of our world that are bigger and nobler and more heroic and more exciting. Every typical myth, every solid story has a certain shape, a certain structure, which is very much like life itself. We all have in our lives a beginning, middle, and end. And legends are the same way. They all follow the same pattern in the sense that you have a hero, and this hero has to have a problem, has to have an obstacle to overcome, a villain to defeat, a quest that must be accomplished.
What we call myth today has gone beyond heroes and villains. It is not just a story, it is a feeling. And it doesn't end with childhood.
Founded and came to dominate the American film industry. Read how men such as Louis B. Mayer and the Warner Brothers created the image of America out of their own idealism, an image so powerful that it ultimately came to shape the myths, values, and traditions of America itself.
Morgan Stanley.
Please hang up and try again. Thank you.
The story of the 20th century is one of detection, of reading the overload of signs and symbols, of finding our way. It takes place in the very image of complexity, the city. So why, in the heart of this world built upon reason, is there a statue of a giant who once, it was said, carried the world upon his shoulders? His name in the Greek myth was Atlas, and the world he carried was a simpler place, when the sea, the sky, and the earth were subject to the power of the gods, and the gods lived on Mount Olympus. For the ancient Greeks, the stories told about the Olympian gods made sense of the natural and supernatural in human terms. Different gods had different natures. They may have been larger than life, but they were true to it. Invisible on their mountaintop, their influence extended everywhere in the visible world below. Everything under the sun had an aspect of sacredness, and a sacred flame burned on every altar. In myth, man defined his place between the beasts and the gods. Myth was inseparable from the religious ritual which held the community together.
Everybody lives by myths in one sense or another. Reality is too complicated, there's too much of it. It's not really possible to understand the flow of impressions and information that come in on us day by day. You have to find patterns that enable you to sort out what's important and what's not. This whole process of selection, so to speak, is what the myths did over generations in Greece until they finally got the form, so to speak, in which some kind of pattern of human life, one that might not be too cheerful, it might even be frightening in some ways, but it was satisfying because it's better than chaos.
The stories themselves are survivors. Greek myths, like the adventures of Odysseus, lived on in the imagination of succeeding generations, inspiring high art and literature, being plundered by comic strips and movies. The literary tradition began with the Romans, who called the wandering hero Ulysses, and it isn't over yet. The journey to the underworld, the battle with the Cyclops, have their distinctive modern interpretation, too.
They've lasted in the sense, I think, because they do enshrine enduring values, not just Greek values, but human values and human problems above all. They're nearly all set, so to speak, in a problematic situation of some kind. Oedipus is the great example. And Oedipus, of course, I mean, Sigmund Freud, who just lost his father and was trying to reevaluate his feelings about his father, happened to come across this tragedy of Sophocles, and as he writes to his friend Fleece, this is the origin of his great Oedipus theory, which, whether you believe it or not, has had an enormous influence on the modern consciousness.
We can almost put a date to when that modern consciousness begins.
À la Comédie Française.
In 1885, when Sigmund Freud was studying in Paris, he went to see Mounet Sully in the role of Oedipus. The great actor was later filmed in the same role. And as far as we can tell, this is a recording of the voice that Freud heard.
Il hurle, mais il y a en tout une cinquantaine de vers qu'il dit comme un livre.
La France, attendant quelque chance meilleure.
Freud, of course, will have been saturated in the classics at school, and through him there's a fairly barbarous myth in Hesiod about the father of Zeus castrating his father, and of course a more sophisticated myth in Sophocles about Oedipus killing his father and marrying his mother and so on. Those myths, through Freud, have had far more effect upon us than they ever had on the Greeks.
In the myth, Oedipus solves the riddle of the Sphinx by giving the answer, man. To Freud, man himself was the riddle, and the answer was to be found in the scientific study of mental processes.
For any mythology to live, for any mythology to be important, it must be believed in. It's very difficult when a mythology, when the religion which supports the mythology, when the mythology itself has died or has become literary, has become devoid of meaning. It's very difficult to revive it. Freud, I think, succeeded in doing that by harnessing myth to the movements of the subconscious and the unconscious. He made us aware once again of the dangers of myth. he made us see that myth actually had a hidden meaning, which was not just the meaning of the story. And that seems to me that in that way he essentially recreated one of the basic functions of myth in the classical world.
What was written here has changed the way we think about ourselves. Freud's study has been preserved as he left it. It has become a modern shrine, a place of clues. Among the objects on his desk is the one he prized above all others, the first to be rescued when he fled from the Nazis. A statue of Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. His life's work embodied the command written above the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Know thyself.
When he was conducting his own self-analysis, he wrote that in his own case he'd discovered love of the mother and jealousy of the father. And he then said, I propose to generalize this. This is what all mankind feels. And this is, of course, why the Oedipus myth has such an enormously powerful effect on us. It's because it reflects or represents a universal in the human mind. I think it is obviously very important that our earliest emotional relationships to our parents do, in fact, shape the rest of our lives to some extent, perhaps not quite to the extent that Freud thought, but nevertheless it is very important, and he did get on to a kind of universal, and universals are expressed in mythological terms.
Freud described the new method he evolved. I hold to the plan of getting the patient to lie on a couch while I sit behind out of sight. His neurotic patients, mostly women from the Viennese bourgeoisie, would be asked to free associate. He would tell them, ordinarily, you try to keep a connecting thread running through your remarks. In this case, you must proceed differently. Say whatever goes through your mind. Act as though you were a traveller sitting next to the window of a railway carriage, describing the changing view which you see outside. Never forget that you have promised to be absolutely honest and never to leave anything out because, for some reason or other, it is unpleasant to tell it. They remembered their childhood. They told him their dreams. By pursuing the unbroken chain of association, he believed he had discovered an often deliberately buried past, an infantile sexuality, the underworld of thought. Once one accepted the notion of the unconscious, everyday life was transformed. The surface of things was no longer to be trusted, but to be interpreted. In his own words, the method of psychoanalysis would lead to a new and deeper science of the mind. Freud compared his work to the greatest discoveries of contemporary archaeology. Heinrich Schliemann had found and excavated Troy. Arthur Evans unearthed a labyrinth at Knossos. Like them, Freud's Oedipus seemed to be a myth come true. I hardly dare believe it yet, Freud wrote of the childhood scene he had found in his own self-analysis. It is as if Schliemann had again dug up Troy, which before him was considered legendary. Freud saw Schliemann's excavation of Troy as the fulfillment of a childhood wish. He felt it all the more keenly because the results of his own excavation of the mind were intangible and far less acceptable to society. As a Jew, Freud was an outsider in the scientific establishment. Schliemann was the very image of what he wanted to be. When The Interpretation of Dreams was published at the turn of the century, its epigraph was from Virgil, in the Latin of the classically educated elite. Since I cannot move the gods above, I shall move the gods below.
I think psychoanalysis often begins with a kind of picture of a descent into the unconscious. Certainly my own training analysis started with a dream in which I remember a female figure leading me down some pathway into the abyss. I think that is a mythological picture of going into the recesses of the mind and finding what you do there.
If dreams were a kind of individual myth-making, were myths the things that a culture dreams?
Freud, of course, was the person who used mythology to describe this in the first place, and then it was taken up by Jung, who actually made greater use of myth than did Freud.
Freud wrote, "If I am Moses, then you are Joshua, and will take possession of the promised land of psychiatry, which I shall only be able to glimpse from afar."
Jung added a great dimension to the understanding of dreams because he introduced this system of comparing these mythological night dreams with actual myths and showing that there was a level of mind, which he called the collective unconscious, or the objective psyche, which was a myth-producing part of the mind. And once you're in touch with that, it actually transforms life.
In the first years of the 20th century, technology seemed to be rushing the industrialized world towards an uncertain future. Freud was not the only one responsible for reopening the question of man's place between the beasts and the gods. If science and technology, once the new languages of faith, now led to doubt and confusion, what would be left to believe in? It was a question which later provoked Jung's most famous work, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. He suggested that for a true description of ourselves, we need the language of myths, a metaphor or a pattern to evoke significance. The pattern of the modern age was a paradox of order and confusion. It was the pattern of the city.
I think the myth of the labyrinth reflects a complexity of the human mind. I mean, the descent into the labyrinth is self-exploration, really, and finding secrets and perhaps rather frightening things down there. A lot of the myths of heroes descending into hell and then coming up again and being reborn are to do with this process.
The idea of the labyrinth may have come from the maze of chambers below the palace of the Cretan king, or the patterned floor marked with the movements of a ritual dance. But in the story, it is a prison from which no one had ever escaped.
Step in, watch the doors on the up-down low. Step all the way in. Yeah, Grant, what for you?
Its hero is Theseus, who, in order to save his fellow Athenians from sacrifice, goes into the labyrinth alone. waiting for him is a creature half man and half beast, who will devour anyone he finds there, the Minotaur.
425 with line 1. Can't get the line up at 38. 20 was also 1. Thank you.
Everyone's had this sense sooner or later of being in some kind of maze. You don't know whether you should go backwards or forwards, and you quite know where you're going. That labyrinth is, I think, a symbol for this sort of feeling we often have of being lost. Because the fact that there's the Minotaur at the center of it, if you get there, you've got to fight this monster, there's something else. Perhaps that's true of many of the mazes we're in, and the reason we can't find our way to the center is we don't really want to get there.
He was a +6.
Theseus could only get out because of the thread that Ariadne was holding, and this again is a symbol of a great many of the mental states one gets into, especially if you're doing any kind of intellectual work. You often feel that there's no way out from what you're doing. It turns out to be something that you hadn't particularly thought about, some small clue, so to speak, and clue, of course, is the word for the thread that's unfolded, that leads you back out of the labyrinth.
Clue hunting has become the pattern of the 20th century story. The detective, its hero, and Oedipus, the example of a man who has to know the truth at whatever cost. As they separately pursued their studies of the unconscious into the realms of mythology and religion, conflict between Freud and Jung became apparent.
Freud was always a very literal-minded person. He wanted to always get back to actual experience and actual infantile experience, and felt that that was the explanatory principle. Jung took a great many things which Freud took as literal, as symbolic, and he was much more interested in the metaphorical use of language than Freud was. Freud always wanted to get back to the literal, to the body, to the concrete. Jung took into account the symbolic, the metaphorical, the poetical, and especially perhaps the religious, because Jung firmly believed that man couldn't live without having some sort of mythological substratum of belief. And Freud thought that that was all totally illusory and should be got rid of, and that the cold light of reason should be the only thing that guided man. And Jung ultimately thought that reason was an inadequate guide.
Below the surface decorum demanded by Viennese society, Freud accused Jung of being mystical and superstitious. Jung accused Freud of wallowing in the sewers of the unconscious. Myth was the cause of the dispute, but the territory being fought over was the mind itself.
Is that you? You're through, Harry. Come out. You haven't got a chance this way. What do you want?
Freud felt so anxious for his new science of psychoanalysis, he cast himself as the father to Jung's Oedipus. It is testimony to the strength of his own unconscious fantasies that he twice blacked out in Jung's presence. We all go into the dark. The cinema was the medium of the next generation of storytellers, to which Freud's theories of the unconscious at once lent meaning. Manhattan, city of the mythic skyline, has more psychoanalysts per square mile than anywhere else on Earth. We carry with us mental baggage of Hollywood Freud and Madison Avenue Jung. Thanks to advertising and the movies, we have learned to take the underworld of hidden meanings for granted. Know thyself has become big business. Jungians still say we must make our own myths to give significance to our lives. That old patterns of the hero's quest still hold true. Twice a week. And that the latest incarnation of Oedipus just might be standing at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, waiting for the lights to change.
Perfect. New York Lotto. All you need is $1 and a dream.
Good taste and proportion. The ancient Greeks, however, would have seen her as mutilated and horrifying. We'll be finding out more about this discrepancy of taste between our world and the ancients in episode 3 of Greek Fire.
Oh, you temptress. Oh, you voluptuous Jezebel. My Aphrodite. Go on, I'm gonna win her here, mate.
The J. Paul Getty Museum announced today that it has acquired an important over-life-size statue of the late 5th century BC. In accord with museum policy, neither the name of the vendor nor the price paid may be disclosed. But it is believed to be a cult figure representing Aphrodite, the goddess of love.
Two lumps of stone, 2,500 years apart. Both with the same name, both something to do with what we call art. Exactly what depends on how you look at it.
This one is coming down, and of course this is the one that's been in the
The Aphrodite will be removed from public view for conservation treatment, which will include mounting the statue on a base designed to isolate it from an earthquake shock.
To the curators, their work is a matter of life and death.
If it doesn't quite go, we'll push the cart. Another 2 inches.
By the time they have finished, the statue will have a better chance than they have of surviving an earthquake intact.
Not down. That's it? Yeah.
The Aphrodite is precious because it is unique. Its very survival gives value. But the Getty also paid an undisclosed number of millions of dollars because in the eyes of experts, she is considered beautiful. And that, as ever, is a matter of taste.
What's in there?
Nothing, you keep out of there.
Oh! What's that?
What's what?
That great ugly thing here.
Great ugly thing? That is Aphrodite at the waterhole.
What's it doing in here? Get it out of my house! Get it out of my house!
It's not doing any harm, it's a work of art. Look, she's beautiful.
I will not have these hawking great lumps of stone in my apartment. It's disgusting.
Of all the things the Greeks had a word for, art is not one of them. A word they used was mimesis, imitation. The body of man himself was generally the subject of this imitation, with an extra ingredient, a persuasive difference from reality, which we, like the Greeks, call beauty. Part of the function of art has always been to isolate an image out of a crowd of impressions, and we owe it to the Greeks that our art is based on life. The ancient Jews forbade all representations of the visible world. The Egyptians produced graven images within strict religious conventions. Only in Greece is there an evolution in the images of man, a kind of progress towards lifelikeness. Greek art is the basis of all Western art, but it's not quite as simple as that. Over 2,000 years of history, we've learned to see this tradition in a certain way. Michelangelo's David is a Renaissance work sculpted by a man who knew Greek, loved and copied Greco-Roman statues, and set out to better them within their own tradition. This is a copy, one of thousands on sale in garden centers around the world. And this is what it would have looked like if there had been garden centers in classical Greece. The marble was originally painted. The flesh of the male statues was stained a warm brown. In fact, they were more lifelike than we want them to be. Not like art, not tasteful at all. We have known about the colouring of statues since the 19th century, yet it is a fact that we still find hard to accept. We prefer our statues to be pure and white. In the museum of our imagination, there is an ideal beauty which the Greeks themselves would hardly have recognized. And whiteness isn't all we've learned to appreciate. The fragmented torso is much more tasteful than the copy ever was. One thing more, and it's ready for the museum. The experience of the museum is often of something far more dead than alive. While they have guaranteed the survival of these works, they do seem to have enshrined a high and holy idea of art, which sometimes puts a barrier between the works and ourselves.
As a result of the rain, Isuzu is providing free cover for your assets. Buy a selected KB single cab bucky and get a slipstream canopy at no extra cost. Or speak to your participating Delta dealer about the other value offers he's cut out for you. Great value and no bull.
There was a time when antiquity fired the imagination, when Greece was the last word in fashion, when gentlemen might view the statues by torchlight, as they believed the ancients had done before them. So great was the status of these works that completely imaginary collections were painted as the proper backdrop to the man of taste. Antiquity was something to be studied and acquired. The rediscovery of these works had begun 3 centuries earlier. In the Renaissance, they were dug from the soil of Italy, where they had been buried since the fall of Rome. The statues which were known by the middle of the 18th century were mostly Roman or Roman copies, but they were treated as landmarks pointing the way to Greece. But the idea of Greece was about to be reinvented to revolutionary effect. Antiquity became an exalted past which made the future worth striving for. The statues themselves were evidence of that. Art offered proof that man could change for the better. One critic in particular imagined a land where beautiful bodies exercised under the purest sky and concluded, "There is but one way for the moderns to become great. I mean by imitating the ancients." He wrote those words before he had ever seen an original statue. His Greece was a place of the imagination to which he made pilgrimage time and time again. The Greeks, he said, had gone beyond nature to an ideal realm, and a man of sensitivity might follow them. He looked at Rome, but he saw Greece. In many ways, we have learned to see with his eyes. Greece was his inspiration, and the way we look at Greek art, and indeed all art, will never be the same again. His name was Johann Joachim Winckelmann, and he was born in Prussia in 1717. His father was a cobbler, and his first job was as a teacher in a village school, yet he became the most influential art critic of the century. He saw himself as a scholar, but when he died, he was mourned as a visionary all over Europe. His writing has a deeply wishful sensuality, and when he describes the Apollo Belvedere, he is moved to an almost mystical ecstasy. The statue of Apollo is the highest ideal of art. His lofty look seems to gaze into infinity. Scorn sits upon his lips, and his nostrils swell with suppressed anger. In the presence of this miracle of art, I forget all else, and I myself take a lofty position for the purpose of looking upon it in a worthy manner. My breast seems to swell with reverence, and I feel myself transported to Delos and into the Lycian groves, places which Apollo honored by his presence, for my image seems to receive life and motion. Winckelmann is a hard act to follow. We can buy the T-shirt, but can we reproduce the enthusiasm? After such intoxication, can we visit the museum and experience anything more than a hangover? The most famous statue unearthed during the Renaissance showed the death throes of the Trojan priest Laocoon. Long before he saw the real thing, Winckelmann had observed that a great soul lies sedate beneath the passions in Greek figures. 'Tis in the face of Laocoon this soul shines with full luster. Pangs piercing every muscle, every laboring nerve. While we consider not the face, only the belly contracted by excruciating pains. The last and the most eminent characteristic of the Greek works is a noble simplicity and a calm grandeur in gesture and expression. Even when describing the statue in clinical detail, he saw beyond and behind its appearance to the ideal. The critic who saw in the Laocoon the quality of simplicity was seeing what he wanted to see, yet the word came to sum up the appeal of antiquity and its power over the mind of Europe. Eine edel Einfalt und ein stille Große became a slogan for Greek art. Today, we have to find our own response, somewhere between the slogan's extravagance and the dead weight that classical art has gathered after centuries in the museum. The question is, how do we learn to see again for ourselves? If this torso wasn't in the Louvre, would we give it a second look? Or is there really something special about the focus on the human form here, a dynamic stillness? And if there was, could you ever see it on television?
This particular type of vessel.
We look at Greek art as a composite of all the past ways of looking at Greek art. We see the same fragments, but with our own way of seeing. Back in the 18th century, the reputation of painted Greek pottery was given an enormous boost when Sir William Hamilton published a lavish catalogue of his collection. Seen like this, Greek art became accessible and marketable, enough to persuade the British Museum to buy the whole collection. Supported by the kind of scholarship Winckelmann had made fashionable, Greek painting was seen to have the same quality of simplicity as sculpture. He described it as contour, the distinction of the ancients. In the Greece of the imagination was found the art of a people who saw in a hard, clear light. Outline, clarity, purity, the world made perfectly simple. There was even a legend to support the claim that outline was the first quality of art itself. A Corinthian girl, to keep the memory of her departing lover alive, cast the shadow of his profile on a wall and drew around it. This was the first picture. In the flicker of torchlight, shadows moved. The statues took on a life of their own. Such viewings were fashionable at the end of the century, and when Lord Elgin brought the Parthenon marbles to London in 1806, they found an audience ready to will them into motion. There is a paradox in the art we have inherited from the Greeks, an art which can preserve life, beauty, a moment, forever, by stopping it dead. When John Keats wrote his ode on a Grecian urn, the urn was the symbol of this paradox, and the marbles were his inspiration. Their very shape implied emotion, like a strip cartoon. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? The marbles were a revelation to the new generation of romantics. Keats's friend Benjamin Haydon spent hours sketching them by candlelight, savoring an overwhelming sense of loss. As the light streamed across the room, there was something solemn and awful in the grand forms that lay scattered about in sublime insensibility. The remains, the only remains of a mighty people. Since most of what we have is fragments, we have learnt to see beauty in fragments. Like photographs, fragments make artists of us all by cropping reality. The most famous statue from antiquity is a beautiful woman, the Venus de Milo. She is a beautiful woman without arms. The Greeks would have seen her mutilated form as an object of disgust. Throughout the 19th century, scholars proposed a number of reconstructions of the sculpture, and it is these proposals which offend us today. The Venus, or rather Aphrodite, will never now be restored, and for us, she's not a fragment. She is a cliché of beauty.
Now, I think we'll just have a couple of chips off the old hooter, eh? You like that, wouldn't you? A bit off the old bridge of the nose there. Don't worry, it's coming beautifully. Nearly finished, my beauty. Soon you'll be ready to go out into the world and drive men mad with desire. I created you. I'm your master.
Hiram Power's statue, The Greek Slave, was a popular hit at the Great Exhibition in 1851. The good name of Greece and pure white marble were all that was needed to turn a naked body into a nude, and far from shocking, it was seen as an example of passionless perfection. For the Victorians, the double standard of art and life could be especially troubling. But in the story of Pygmalion, they rediscovered a myth by which they could think the unthinkable. What if the statue were alive? Pygmalion was a sculptor who, praying for the gift of lifelikeness in his work, has his desire granted by Aphrodite. It is a story that always seems to stop at the moment of transformation, leaving the consequences to be guessed at. Burne-Jones also stops as the problem gets interesting. Each painting has a coyly rhyming title. The Heart Desires. The Hand Refrains. The Godhead fires. The soul attains. But what about the body? If you have an art based on the imitation of the human body, where do you draw the line? Fine art with a capital A tells us that you can look, but you can't touch. And if it moves, it's rude. It didn't take the new medium of cinema long to exploit these double standards. We live in an age when the moving image is commonplace, and art has been dramatically redefined. Yet the conventions and forms of Greek art survive and are reinterpreted by each generation.
What is it? It's a nude.
It's not nice. It's got no clothes on.
But of course it hasn't got any clothes on. She's a nymph. What's the point of coming up out of a waterhole with clothes on? Oh, you're impossible, madam.
I've got no time for naked women without any clothes on. They're lewd.
My dear good woman, artists have been painting and sculpting nude women since the beginning of time. Nude modelling is a very respectable profession these days.
Here, have you been having models up here? Have there been naked women in my establishment?
Of course there haven't. I can't afford 30 bob an hour. I did that from memory. That is women as I see them.
Oh, you poor man.
The way we see things is still very much influenced by one man and the burst of enthusiasm for Greek art that he helped to generate. A lot of the snobbery, the vanity and the elitism of the art world can be traced back to the passion of Winckelmann, which gave life and light to the ancient stones.
Il mare, forza arcana e misteriosa.
At least once in this century, we have had the chance to see the very finest Greek art in comparative innocence, out of the blue. In 1972, a diver off the coast of southern Italy discovered two 5th century bronze figures. They were fine works from the height of the classical period, and they were unknown. This was the real thing. We could make of them what we wanted.
A Riace intanto scoppiava la polemica.
We put them on television.
Calabrese rivendicavano l'appartenenza delle statue.
We put them in a museum.
In esse la possibilità di risolvere una crisi economica anch'essa con radici.
We made money out of them.
Dopo una breve parentesi a Roma, ospiti del Quirinale, le statue...
The two statues caused a sensation which had little to do with art with a capital A. People queued for hours to see them. What struck some people was an aura the statues had, making them more like images of local saints. But what struck most people was their erotic power. Amongst the publications cashing in on the phenomenon was a series of pornographic comic books. Was this an authentic 20th century response to Greek art in the raw? For whatever reason, people swooned in their presence. One expert described the statues as an aesthetic slap in the face. And in the comic book, the story is Pygmalion with a twist. Only in the 20th century, we get to see what happens next.
Six quarks. Up, down, strange, charm, truth, and beauty. 6 leptons, of which 3 are neutrinos. These are the fundamental particles.
The world is made of 12 fundamental particles.
They have no internal structure.
Each has its name.
So they cannot be cut.
And its special properties.
They have mass.
Some of those properties are understood.
Charge.
Others remain obscure.
And spin.
But they too will be understood in time.
But no radius. They occupy no space.
When that happens, physicists will have arrived at the end of their search. They will understand not only what the world is made of, but also how it works. They believe that they will get there soon.
Okay, so we started with a run going in the machine, but you can see the dead time was essentially 50%, so that was the trigger.
Fermilab is a particle accelerator, in effect, the world's largest microscope. Its job is to probe the basic structure of matter to reveal the behavior of the fundamental particles. There is also a confidence that it will reveal the truth. Where does that confidence come from? Why believe that we can explain how the world works? The director of Fermilab is very specific. The quest he is engaged with, and which he hopes to finish, began in an ancient Greek town called Miletus, 2,600 years ago.
It was then, I think, that the first scientific question was asked, as far as we can tell, and that is, how does the world work? And how does the world work on the basis of logic, on the basis of what was called ordinary thinking, and in which we put aside mythology, we put aside superstition, we put aside magic, and we say, can we understand, is there a rational basis for the way the world works? And the Greek word cosmos is a word for order. Is there an order to the thing? The notion that the world, in all of its incredible complexity, has an underlying simplicity, an overarching principle that would explain everything. That was a tremendous breakthrough, of course, the beginnings of a scientific issue, and began what we now put us on the path to where we are here at Fermilab and in our activities to try to understand how the universe works. What is that overarching principle? And we're still after it.
In our own century, Albert Einstein has said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And the belief that it could be began in Greece.
Air is a god, and comes into being and is measureless and infinite, and always in motion. Air is always in motion, for things that change do not change unless there be movement. Thus do tall trees bear eggs. First, olives. The moon is made of earth and has plains and ravines on it. Shells are found inland and in the mountains. We do not feel the heat of the stars because they are so far from the earth. The real nature of things tends to disguise itself.
These were the thoughts of the first scientists, the pre-Socratics.
Obviously, in terms of their answers, they seem to be very primitive. In terms of the question they asked, they are giants. Let us view them in the historical context. There were 2,000 years of observations in Babylon and in Egypt, but never was an attempt made to reduce the manifoldness of all these observations, good observations, to a simplified, unified explanation accessible to human reasons.
The first attempt at a simple, unified explanation was made by Thales of Miletus. The world, he claimed, was made of water. Such an answer was far from obvious, but the counterintuitive answer was characteristic of pre-Socratic thought. Thales observed that water can change state, that it falls from the sky, that without water all living things die. The search had begun, soon to be advanced in a remarkable way.
But I think the leader in all of this was clearly Democritus, who was a tremendous guy and also a very humorous man, and but with a tremendous intellect. And of course, his great contribution was the atom, the invention of the atom, which in Greece means you cannot cut, atom, not to be cut. The notion that there was a limit to the divisibility of matter. Tremendous breakthrough, because you have to imagine in those early times, and with these strictly logical philosophers, the notion of the atom had to be accompanied by another invention, which was space.
They move in the void, and when they come together, they cause coming to be, and when they separate, they cause perishing. They have effects and are affected whenever they happen to be in contact. But when they are compounded together and entangled, they create something. They move through the void, which yields and does not resist them.
He had to have these things in constant motion. And then he got into the fight with what causes the motion. And he wanted to finesse that. And he said, motion is. And motion is a natural ingredient of the existence of atoms. And that's so close to Galileo and Newton's first law that it, again, gives you these bursts of wonder at how he could have this kind of an imagination. And that brings us to Empedocles.
If the world was made of tiny, shifting atoms, what made them cluster together or move apart?
Here is for the first time the recognition of the necessity of accounting for force. Now, which are these forces? They can be reduced to two cosmic forces, which he calls love and conflict, or love and hatred, or in physical terms, attraction and repulsion.
In suggesting the atom, Democritus predicted one overriding concern of modern physics. In developing the concept of force, Empedocles predicted the other. Empedocles touched upon another fundamental modern concept, too.
He applies his insights also to observing certain phenomena, and he is the first to recognize that light takes time. The production of light and the wandering of light is something which can be measured in time. Also a novel, totally novel insight. So much for Empedocles.
Empedocles' inspiration was the almost legendary figure of Pythagoras. Pythagoras was fascinated by numbers, and the symmetry of numbers which could be represented as squares in particular. Adding the square of 3 and the square of 4, the result is another square, the square of 5. He called this a perfect square. The consequence was his now famous theorem. On a right-angled triangle, the square of the side opposite the right angle is the sum of the square of the other two sides. The theorem has been a basis of mathematics ever since. Pythagoras' fascination with maths had even deeper consequences. He was the first to connect the perfectly symmetrical world of mathematics and the human world of sight, sound, and touch. When a harp string is plucked, it reverberates and gives out a note. There is no obvious relationship to numbers here. But if the same string is stopped halfway up, the note rises by a perfectly harmonious interval, an octave. The exact mathematical division of the string causes the felt harmony in the music. Maths and music were expressions of the same thing. Plato took this idea further. The symmetry of maths was the principle which explained how the world worked. All the immense complexity of the world could be reduced to the existence of 5 mathematically regular solids. Spinning through the universe, they created everything we can touch, feel, and see. This theory suggests the deep Greek confidence in an order underlying the universe. The world might seem to change, but the order was unchanging and would last forever.
Men's wit grows as they encounter what is present. Appearances are a glimpse of the obscure.
The order lasted forever, but it was hidden from us. It hinted to us and whispered to us, but we would never see it or touch it.
An unapparent connection is stronger than an apparent one.
One day we might hold the overarching principle. but in our minds, not in our hands. But another Greek voice was to drown the whispers out, a voice which exhorted us to rest content with what we could see or could touch. The hidden order was to shroud itself completely. The influence of Aristotle upon later thought is impossible to overestimate. In medieval times, he was, as Dante put it, the master of those who know, and on the huge range of subjects which he investigated, his word was law. He was endlessly consulted. The answer, one could be sure, was in Aristotle. At the Christian Cathedral of Chartres was one of the greatest centers of medieval learning. Christianity always enjoyed an uneasy relationship with the thought of ancient Greece. They regarded it as pagan, but its insights were the basis of much of their thought. And when this cathedral was built for the glory of God in a river valley in northern France, a pagan thinker from northern Greece, who had been dead for 13 centuries, was given his memorial on it. Aristotle is built into the stone of the Middle Ages.
We are like dwarfs on the shoulders of giants, says Bernard of Chartres, the elder brother of Thierry. We are dwarfs compared with them, but we see, being on their shoulders, we are raised aloft by the giants of old and see further than them. So this is the relationship, and this image was preserved. Newton still preserves it, repeats it, and Bentley, and so many others. So here you have the wondering admiration for the past and the recognition of the necessity to build on them. It's an integral part of Christian education. This is Chartres.
But the master of those who know suffered from being law. One thread ran throughout the huge mass of Aristotle's work. It was empirical. All this detail confined itself to the world of the everyday senses, to what could be seen and touched. To the hidden and the conjectural, it was unsympathetic.
Aristotle, the great master of the schools, when it came to women, he fell a victim to a courtesan, namely Phyllis, who was a very beautiful woman, and Alexander, who was Aristotle's pupil. He said, well, my master, who always speaks of logic, let us see whether he will, by logic, be victorious when it comes to deal with this beautiful woman. Where Alexander hid behind a curtain, and he had instructed this courtesan, beautiful woman, to tell Aristotle, well, I will be yours if at first you will be on all fours and I can ride on you. Then Alexander came out and saw him in this situation. Now, this was interesting for medieval students, and there were many rhymes on this, and we find that even in some later cathedrals, Aristotle being here on all fours, that was in classic. So you find that there is a certain rebellion against the supremacy of logic or analytical philosophy, you would say nowadays.
The ideas of Aristotle were eventually superseded by men such as Galileo and Harvey, but they still used the tools of empiricism and logic. His influence has been obscured only in this century, when those tools have been discovered to conflict. Werner Heisenberg realized that as men looked at the world more and more closely, it seemed to make less and less sense.
Let's see, this is in the 20s when the problems that were coming out of the data that looked at atoms at the time was absolutely baffling. It was as if you know, the Starship Enterprise landed on a strange planet and the laws of physics that were known to them were just not working. And then it was the best minds in Europe of the time, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bohr, of course, that eventually solve the problem, and solve the problem in a way that was extremely dramatic and extremely counterintuitive. And it's often that counterintuitive part of it that's emphasized, because here is a theory called quantum mechanics, which is now used every day by us, and which is the most accurate theory ever written down. It can predict, well, everything we know about the world with great precision, and yet it starts. Its initiating statement is the so-called Heisenberg uncertainty relations, which say there are certain things you cannot know, intrinsically cannot know.
The tiny particle tracks, which modern particle accelerators can now make visible, reveal a bizarre, counterintuitive world beyond the range of our everyday senses. Even by looking at the particles, we affect them. They seem to be in two places at once, or to be spontaneously created out of nothing. These tracks hint at a reality, but a reality which is hidden from us. Quantum mechanics is a challenge to all orthodoxy. It has undermined notions about the way the world works that have dominated science since Aristotle. This century's extraordinary technological development, the unprecedented drama and excitement of its science, grow out of a theory of uncertainty, which claims that our senses are not an adequate guide in the search for the way the world works. An uncertainty which does have a precedent. In 1961, Heisenberg spoke at a conference in Athens. He was the pioneer of the theory of uncertainty, and he understood its suggestion of a hidden reality which could not be probed by everyday experience. How then was it to be understood?
Unless we get still more deeply into this mathematical side of nature, we will have difficulty in understanding it. We are going further and further from our primitive, daily life experience. In these new fields, our language ceases to act as a reasonable tool.
Mathematics provided the key, and in so saying, Heisenberg's appeal was to Pythagoras, the most modern science called on the most ancient. Heisenberg felt that the hidden order was revealed in the beauty of numbers.
In a more frontier sense, many theorists are guided, I think, in their writing down of a synthesis, a theoretical synthesis, by the kind of mathematics and the kind of beauty that they see in the mathematics. And it's a question of training, just as say a Martian coming down to the Earth, and you put him in front of the National Gallery, in front of some painting, and he won't understand it at all. He wouldn't have the culture to understand it. In the same way, you need some processing, if you like, before you can understand the beauty of an equation. But it's there, and it has the same kind of aesthetic, cultural drive that this is it. This is beautiful. It must be the truth.
The connection between truth and beauty is pure Greek and the heart of modern science. The very names of the fundamental particles reflect it.
It even applies to apparatus. There are many eminent experimenters who refuse to use apparatus that looks ugly, but they put into it a kind of aesthetic appearance. One of my old professors at Columbia University, the marvelous name of Polycarp Kusch, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on electrons, insisted that his students polish the brass and organize the apparatus so that it looks pleasing. He says, otherwise, it just won't work, he said.
Atoms possess no weight. The sun endues the moon with brightness.
The hidden reality is necessarily strange to us in our everyday lives. The voices, old and new, that describe it still challenge our comprehension.
They write down mathematical equations which they get ecstatic about, and you know they're having a lot of fun. But we, more experimental physicists who want to know whether their theory will predict the results of experiments we're going to do, or will account for the experiments we already have done, we get a total disconnect. So there are all of these theories having a wonderful time with themselves, and occasionally at seminars telling us about how much fun they're having, and then losing us completely in the most abstract mathematics you can possibly imagine. And then they go away laughing and chortling, and we're left wondering what it is that they said.
Think of this and to say that the effective tension is the original tension minus beta times the free energy of the conformation.
Yet the gods have not revealed all things to men from the beginning. But by seeking, men find out better in time.
As far as stiffness is concerned, I think we've got that right. But as far as stickiness is concerned, we've only got a tiny fraction of the total configuration. And you can see the effect of that. I mean, it counterbalances the stiffness, all these sticky fingers.
All things that are known have number.
This coefficient changes because of the stickiness or because of the bendiness.
Yeah, but we don't know what that coefficient is.
We don't know what that coefficient is anyway, so twice it does.
Let these things be thought of as resembling the truth. Nothing occurs at random, but everything for a reason and by necessity.
Classical Hagedorn model, the universe was at the Hagedorn temperature initially, and it cooled down, right?
There's a basic question, and we're always asked that by the decision makers who have a morbid interest in how much we're going to spend next year. When is this going to be over? When are you going to finally answer the question that was raised first by Thales in Miletus about 2,600 years ago? And there's also a feeling, I think, which comes from more immediate experience that nature is infinitely complex. And I think in many ways nature is infinitely complex, so that the chemists will never run out of things to do in chemistry. And the biologists will similarly never run out of challenging problems in biology. But the particle physicists, allied now with the cosmologists, the people who are worried about the evolution of the universe, here we're working very much together on these problems. I think we might come to an answer to how the universe works. We'll decide we have an answer if we have a beautiful, simple formula, something you can print on a t-shirt, and students can wear it on campus. And this is the formula which explains fundamentally how the universe works, how it evolved, how we got here, and the nature of the fundamental particles.
Another thing I will tell you. Of all mortal things, none has birth, nor any end and accursed death, but only mingling and interchange of what is mingled. Birth is the name given to these by men.